Hello, and welcome to my talk, Trace, a Creative Practice Exploration of Unidentified Dead. Thank you ever so much to the Human Rights Festival for inviting me to talk at this event. It's a great opportunity, and I have work in an exhibition in the Glass Tank at the moment, and this is what the talk is going to be talking about. It's on in the Glass Tank until the 26th, which is Saturday. So I was going to talk a bit about why am I not? Oh, how do I go back? There we go. Right. Sorry, getting used to this. So I was going to talk about a little bit about sort of where my current research has come from. During my master's, I explored the war in Bosnia and the unidentified dead in the mass graves there. And this is a piece of work that came out of that at that time. And it's centers around the massacre at Srebrenica, where 8,372 people were exterminated in literally a matter of 3 or 4 days. This project was in collaboration with Oxford City Council, who gave me some funding to be able to do this project, and it was exhibited as part of the Srebrenica Memorial event in Oxford Town Hall. I had 372 business cards individually printed with a brief description of the event and what happened. And then I asked members of the public to number individually every single one of the cards as a way of realizing the sheer enormity of the numbers, but the act of physically numbering too became really integral to the actual process of making, and everybody that took part felt that they were taking sort of some responsibility for the lives of the people that they were numbering for. And actually during the process, I got one of those automatic numbering stamps. And during the process of numbering all of these cards individually, the echoey sound of the numbering machine really sounded like gunfire. There was so many elements to this that you couldn't have kind of foreseen in the work leading up, that just became really integral to the part of it. So on my website, where I've got this shown, I've actually recorded a section of the sound of the stamping machine. And then these cards were then individually handed out to people to sort of remind them of those individuals. Every single card is a single person. Every single card is an individual that was killed during that event. And then sort of sometime after that, so after my master's and before my PhD, I was working for Crisis. I was working with rough sleepers in the hub in the centre of Oxford. And, you know, we saw a lot of people coming through the doors, but it made me question the people that don't access the services, the people that are sort of transient homeless who maybe move from one city to another and don't necessarily ask for help and are just sort of, you know, moving around. And so this sort of led me into the current research that I'm doing and looking at unidentified human remains in the UK. And I'm looking at the missing persons database, which is a resource that's available to everybody. It's accessible online, and it's there as a way of helping people who are looking for somebody to see if there's anybody there that they, that sort of resonates with them. And currently, I think there's just over 500, yeah, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but 500 odd entries, and every single one is listed similarly to sort of this person. This guy was found in a wooded area, so it says here, human remains recovered in a barn in a wooded area. They assumed he had been dead for at least 2 years. So by the time he was found, he was completely skeletonized. So the photograph, or not a photograph, but this image is a facial reconstruction done from his skull, which was sent up to Dundee to have the facial reconstruction done. The other thing that the forensic teams did was I think they managed to retrieve fingerprints from the atlases, and also they have a full DNA profile of this individual too. So a lot was done to try and work out who he was, but still remains unidentified. And so it's these ideas that I'm intrigued by. This, on here, he is simply a number, but I started to think about the belongings that he has with him. So it lists the things that he had on his person. I started to think about the place where he was found. So he was found in a wooded area in a barn, and he was completely skeletonized. So, decomposition happened. So I started thinking about the site. I started thinking about the soil and the surrounding area. So all of these things were the sort of beginnings of my sort of starting point for research. And so I looked at a lot of individuals. He became particularly interesting because he's fairly close to here, well, sort of Winchester sort of way. So somewhere I can kind of visit and sort of spend some time thinking about. But I looked at a lot of the database and started to sort of explore sort of similarities, or where there were sort of lots of items that sort of rang true for sort of every entry. I mean, one of the things that rang true for every entry was the fact that shoes were probably the one thing that was a definite with every entry. So this is the wooded area, where it's hard to say exactly, because it's not the missing persons database is not completely specific, but you have to sort of do a bit of reading into it. So this is the site that I think it is, and the photograph is the wooded area where I spent some time kind of looking at the area and thinking about decomposition, thinking about the soil, thinking about the trees and everything that sort of surrounds that space where he was found. And the other thing that I started, so as I started to think about place and space and where people are found, I was looking at cycles, so water cycles, how water has always existed on the planet, and how it has been through every living organism. And so essentially water feels like it is part of every living thing that's ever been on the earth. So water became really important, but also decomposition and adding sort of nitrogen to the soil, and then enhancing the growth of plants, and seeing sort of accelerated plant growth at the sites where people have died became really important. And certainly when I was exploring the Bosnian genocide, one forensic botanist actually used had noticed that mugwort grew particularly vigorously on sites of mass graves. And then she discovered that mugwort has one blue butterfly that only feeds on mugwort. So she spent a lot of time following blue butterflies to this very, and then seeing where mugwort was particularly sort of higher and more vigorous than anywhere else, and actually used that as a way of finding mass graves. So, you know, so there are all these really interesting threads that sort of come into this kind of idea of decomposition, soil and place. And then scientifically, you know, obviously the forensic botanist was able to do that, but on the right of this image, this is a piece of research that was done, and I've referenced it at the bottom, but they now can, in sites of sort of very densely, you know, where the foliage is really dense and you can't get cadaver dogs in, or you can't get a team of people in to look for human remains, but you have an inkling that somebody has died, they can now send drones over the site, and the UAV detection, I don't know the science of it, but you know, they are able now to see changes in the foliage of plant material that has been fed by decomposing remains. So, you know, that felt like a scientific proof for me that, you know, there is this remaining presence at the sites where people have died. And then going back to the missing persons database and the fact that all of the belongings are listed is part of the way forensic teams identify individuals. If you know clothing that person owned. This was shown, so on the left, this image is the book of belongings from Bosnian conflict. So forensic teams, when they found a body, would take the clothes off of that body. They would cross-reference the number of the entry in the missing, in the book of belongings to the body. And rather than have to show loved ones human remains that may or may not be their loved one, they used clothing as the first stage of trying to identify people and give people a name. Bosnia was at a time when DNA testing was not really having, it had never really been used in this way to be able to actually formally identify people. It was just at that sort of turning point when science had started to be. So this was the sort of more normal way of trying to identify people. But what they found in this situation was that because a lot of people had to move considerable distances, people had swapped clothes or given a jumper to somebody, you know, to keep them warm, or you know, people had taken clothing off of a body, or you know, there was so many different ways that people could have swapped and changed clothes that actually it came down to the fact that often it wasn't actually that effective either. And so you know, DNA became really important. The image on the right is a photograph I took in Rwanda last year, and it's taken in a church where sort of massacre happened. And in Rwanda, what they did was take the clothing off of everybody in that church, and they took away the bodies to be buried in large mass graves. And mass graves in this situation is about care, but in Bosnia it was about, you know, we were exhuming mass graves in Bosnia as an act of care, but in Rwanda they were creating mass graves as an act of care. But these clothes are still in place, piled, folded, not washed, folded and piled onto the pews in the church as a sort of lasting memorial to every individual. And so here you know, is the sort of the use of clothing, either as a way of trying to identify, but certainly as a way to sort of show the sheer enormity of a situation. So my research really, as I've sort of progressed through all of the work, you know, it's really starting to formulate this idea for me that what I'm really looking at is that sort of bounded space between one place and another. So it's the very tiny moment between life and death, or when, you know, your belongings, your wallet or your belt is just a ordinary everyday object, but at the moment of death it's suddenly precious and sort of poignant. But you know, all of these other spaces, you know, sort of preserving something and decay and being present and not being, you know, not being here anymore, sort of absent and having decomposed or having gone from people's memories. So you know, all of these spaces, it's about that kind of middle space between the two. So I'll talk about some of the work that then is coming out of my PhD, and these are examples of work that are in the exhibition at the moment as well. This piece of work I did whilst I was in Rwanda. I had very little space in my luggage to be able to take huge amounts of art materials, and so all I just simply took a garden spray bottle for just water, and that was the water was my art material in this instance. And I used a t-shirt of my own, and I placed it in the sites where I knew you know, these atrocities had happened, and simply placed the t-shirt on the ground and sprayed a water halo around them. So I'm referencing the clothing, referencing the sort of absent presence. You know, there isn't a t-shirt there, but there's an obvious presence still remaining with the water. And the fact that the water then evaporates and becomes part of the air feels very much like, you know, I'm exploring the remaining presence. We know water's in the air as moisture, but you can't see it. And it feels like, you know, when you've lost somebody, you know, you sort of still have a sense of them around you, but you can't see them. And so there's these sort of gentle exploration of sort of remaining presence. But again, it's really important that it's the soil too. So it's about decomposition, and it's about sort of being part of the surrounding areas and still sort of remaining there. In the exhibition, there's a 5-minute video as well of the evaporation actually happening, and in the video you can hear sort of life going on in the background. You can see ants walking around in the dust, and somebody walks past in the background. So there's this sort of continuation of life after as well. So I think the video alongside two prints in the exhibition kind of, you know, really helped to sort of reinforce what I'm exploring. So just took a picture of the install as it is in a glass tank at the moment. And this is another piece of work that I'm exploring at the moment. I'm using gelatin bioplastic as a source material to create these sculptural pieces. Earlier on, I spoke about the missing persons database, the one piece of belongings that is on every single entry. I think almost entirely. I think I've done a look through every single one. Even to the point where I think there is a couple of entries that are just a foot in a boot, and that's all that was found. So you know, that's, you know, shoes are all the way through. So I started off with shoes, but I was looking at bioplastic as a material that is transparent, that's sort of barely there, has the potential to decay like our bodies do, would break down, just a bit of moisture or put in the ground, you know, it sort of breaks down and becomes part of the environment. So those were all really interesting, important sort of themes. And I looked at, first I looked at sort of creating clothing by sort of stitching the material. But in the end, I've kind of explored this way of sort of casting these old belongings, because the trace of the wear and tear, the creases in the boot, the marks made, the, you know, slight bit of dirt or mud, you know, they're all part of intrinsic parts of that kind of person's use of that boot. And I think, you know, if we lined up a whole range of the same Adidas shoe, but they all belong to other people, you'd be able to pick out your own, I think. So there's that sort of, there is that sort of individuality, there's that personality, even in the same product. I think once you've worn it enough, it becomes yours, and it becomes very much yours. But I also think, you know, very old, very worn-in shoes, you just wouldn't give to somebody else either. You wouldn't wear. They're just so molded to that person's foot and the way they walk, and the you know, that it's so them. So that's why I started to explore boots and shoes. So I was looking at the missing persons database, looking at the entries to see what sort of boot, what sort of shoe, and what size, and then sourcing those secondhand, because clearly I've got no access to the actual belongings. But that idea of individuality was there. And so this is a size 9 Adidas shoe, and even the imprint of the logo on the tongue of the shoe is captured in the material, and every part of the kind of sort of creases and detail. So these were some of the shoes that I explored, and then I started to look at actually the belongings too. So gloves and a wallet in this instance. And these, there's a bodily, you know, because these items that I've chosen are leather, there's already a bodily aspect to the leather. You can see pores, and you can see that it was, you know, originally an animal. But I also make the bioplastic out of pork gelatin, and that's quite deliberate in that, you know, we are always referred to as being, as, you know, the animal that's closest to us. But forensic teams train their cadaver dogs on pigs currently in the UK. In other countries, they have body farms, but we don't currently in the UK. Well, that's about to change, I think, which would be great. But yeah, so cadaver dogs are trained on pigs, and so pork gelatin felt really important here as well. Again, that sort of bodily aspect, and you know, that the fact that they decompose, so they're really ephemeral. They don't last very long. They've got this sort of you know, it's not very long lasting. And even when I've kept these for any period of time in my studio, if any fluctuations, and they start sort of buckling and changing and sort of warping. And so, you know, I quite like that this is really temporal. There's not a sort of permanence to them. And they're filmed on, I've taken the photographs of them on light boxes, but I also exhibit them on light boxes. But behind, I've done sort of inflated photographs of small aspects of the actual piece. And so I'm really exploring that idea of sort of deeper forensic looking at it, like you would a fingerprint, or like you would you know, DNA profile, anything that's that sort of slightly deeper looking in analyzing. And so that's why you've got the sort of photograph up behind. You know, we're sort of exploring forensic methods. And the last piece of work that's in the exhibition are these clay pieces, not these clay pieces, but clay pieces that I'll show you in a bit. But so the starting point for these pieces that I worked on was clay is a natural resource that is part of the soil. And if we decompose into the ground, we essentially become part of the soil. There are lots of biblical references to clay and how we become clay, and potter's fields in the Bible as well are a place of potter's fields are places where unidentified usually or poor remains are buried, but it's also where the clay is taken out of the ground first. So they take the clay out of the ground, create these big pits, and then those empty spaces are used to fill unidentified remains. And there's a massive potter's field in New York called Hart Island, and that's a fascinating whole other thing to discuss, but really fascinating still to this day. We're burying en masse people that are sort of othered. But these are archaeological pots that have been found as grave goods. So either cremated remains would be put inside them, or they would be used to hold things that people would want to take with them to an afterlife. And I kind of see some of the belongings that I'm looking at, although they're not deliberately buried with somebody, the people have died with those belongings with them, and they feel very much like burial goods, the sort of things that we would historically, previous generations historically have buried people with. But these particular pots have got evidence of, or bodily evidence within them. The image on the right, all of those little marks in the side are somebody's fingernail. And so that very old historical reference to the actual person that physically made that pot was really interesting to me. And fingerprints. And, so there are these references to the actual sort of identity. I mean, when it's a fingerprint, it's how we would identify somebody now. And yet, again, even with that fingerprint, we still can't identify those historical people because we have no reference to them. But these sort of imprints within clay body that kind of, has this sort of bodily aspect to it. So these pieces are clay, made from clay, foraged from the sites where I know unidentified human remains have been found. And what I've done here is, again, referencing the clothing and the material belongings that people are buried with or die with. This materiality has been pressed into wet clay to form a sort of an impression, almost as if you had died and lain in the clay, and that these were kind of scooped up out of the ground as they are, because the impression is on the inside of the bowl shape rather than on the outside in the other examples. And then I have these shards as well. So this idea of sort of fragmented memory is really important. And again, I've used denim and denim jeans here as a very contemporary piece of material. You can see rivets and the stitching, and so they're clearly jeans, but look like archaeological items. So there's this kind of duality that I'm really interested in, the sort of historical unidentified remains with this contemporary unidentified dead, and that act of sort of presence and remaining presence in the soil and the ground where they're found. And this is an install photograph of it at the glass tank currently. And if you haven't been, please go and visit. And I'm happy to meet anybody in the space and talk through my work at any point, maybe this afternoon. But and that's the end of my talk. Thank you. And I wonder if anybody's got any questions.
Well, I was wondering if you feel as though you have a sort of spiritual connection with these people, and that you're doing them a service that the church might have done had they been buried in a churchyard, and you're finding them, you're honouring them because they haven't been honoured before.
I think it's a little bit, I think that there's definitely an element of that. I think there's definitely an act of care that but I can't know, you know, what religious choices they would have made, if any. And so there's, you know, it's definitely just about acknowledging and individualizing. And that's kind of what I'm interested in, allowing a space for people to consider and think about them, whereby I think society would otherwise simply just not acknowledge them. And at the moment, they're just mentions on a missing persons database. There's no other real kind of reference. And I think even locally, people don't necessarily kind of want to remember what happened if it's nearby. Yeah.
I was wondering at what extent you think holding on to a person's objects will become harmful. Let's say like you lost someone and you kind of think of the objects as being connected to them, but like, I feel like there's a break.
I think if it was a loved one, I think there is a bounded space where you would probably stop being so, you know, needing to hold on to that so closely. But I think in this instance, it's about kind of just keeping that memory, that, or at least the acknowledgement that this happens, that I think people are surprised often that we have unidentified dead. They think science can just sort of do it, you know, and it can't, you know, it can't always. And it is about society. It's about being outside a society that sort of stops you being identified. So it's about, I mean, I think if it was somebody you love, then, you know, there is that sort of space for sort of using a belonging as a sort of natural way of mourning somebody. But in this instance, there's no social group mourning that person. They're certainly not looking for them and certainly haven't found them. And so I'm exploring that space and sort of trying to sort of remind people this happens, really. Yeah. Is there anybody online that wants to ask? I don't know whether.
You mentioned about, I mean, there are, of course, I mean, some of the people, it depends upon who they are. For example, if they are a part of genocide, then, I mean, suicide is a way of, you know, keeping them in the memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a way of the whole society trying to sort of, you know, cope with it, you know, trauma, grief. So that's a very important part of that. You know, so that's whether it's like, you know, genocides, big events, or yeah, and big natural hazards like tsunamis and all, right, you know, that's what happens. So, but I think, you know, I mean, I'm also looking at, so some of your examples were also around that, but is the work that you're doing are they what sort of everyday sort of, you know, people who have? Yeah,
so the current PhD really is predominantly looking at people. So the guy I showed earlier on in the slides, you know, I think the assumption is that he was transient homeless person, so moving from one city to another. He had a Winchester to London map, so we can only assume that he died just off of the railway walkway. There's like a track, a walking space. And he, you know, so I think the assumption is that there's that kind of lifestyle, and probably died of exposure. I mean, you know, we don't know, we've got no way of really knowing. And in nearly all of the cases, they are found remotely, you know, mostly I would say homeless, but suicide certainly as part of that too. So without any kind of identifying documents or you know, no credit cards, no, you know, no nothing. So very difficult to identify. And if nobody's then, you know, if you're outside of society, and certainly when I was working for Crisis, there were a lot of people who were very much estranged from family and closer, you know, a network of people other than the homeless community, and they're not necessarily looking out for each other in a way that would identify somebody in death. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I found it really moving, really thought-provoking. And I get that it's you know, an exploration and it's art, but you mentioned that you were working with Crisis kind of when you began this process. And I was wondering if there was much of an overlap between this process and working with Crisis, and if you feel that there are things that you've learned from kind of this exploration that you feel we can kind of turn with what we've learned to kind of homeless people today. And
yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I started my PhD after working, so there was no real overlap, and it was really the sort of thinking whilst working there that sort of seeded this idea for, you know, I'd previously worked with you know, sort of Bosnia. But it's very much not sort of, I mean, it's not my story, but I still feel like it was something I wanted to say, much like a sort of journalist or something like that, I guess. But I guess being able to work close to home was also part of it. But, you know, I think the problem with homeless services in the UK is you really only have any kind of help in a city if you have a connection to that city. So that's why you have transient homeless people, because often they you know, they don't necessarily, you know, for whatever reason, they might not want to be in the city that they have the connections with. Maybe that's where all of their drug background happened and they don't want to spend, you know, it's too risky for them. But if they move to another city, they're not going to get a room, they're not going to get any real support. And so I guess that's kind of the wider problem, I would say. And that's why we've got people, we can only assume, like him, who would be moving around and probably turning up in a city, begging, making small things and selling them to get money, and then kind of, you know, moving to another city and sort of doing that. And we certainly saw people like that. And we would, like, you know, they'd come in for a coffee or whatever, and they'd get, you know, a few bits of food or whatever, but that's probably all they could get in a city that they didn't have a connection to. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Katie, can I ask something?
Yes, absolutely.
I was just trying to think about where this is going to go in the future, your sort of future outcomes in terms of, rather than, you know, the PhD, you're incredibly raising awareness of this problem. And I just wondered whether you're going to continue to show work in an exhibition situation in order to raise awareness, or whether you had something else in mind whereby we can do something about the problem.
I have to say I probably haven't thought that far ahead, and probably
Sorry.
But I do think, I mean, I think I would like to continue in this way, and I definitely see my work being used in a way that raises awareness rather than, I don't want to say simply being, but, you know, not just being the art, that the art can help to tell a wider picture. So I find that the spaces where it's sort of like this human rights festival, but also some of the other opportunities that I've had where I'm moving in spaces that are not necessarily the art spaces, but that it kind of opens up a wider discussion. So I think that possibly things like, funding to create bodies of work that might be used to explore, different aspects of this in a deeper way, possibly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Katie.
Thank you. I think that's it. Well, thank you ever so much to the Human Rights Festival for having me, and thank you for everybody who came along. Stop. Is that it then?
Awesome recording.